pick up tonight, and so our goal will be to cover 24 and start in chapter 25. If we make it a little further or shorter than that, that's okay too. We're coming to the end of the book of Acts, and of course, as you know, we are in this section of the book of Acts, and it is a little bit difficult sometimes to keep it all in order, but I think if we just remember from 21 to the end of Acts, our destination ultimately is Rome, and this is a series of trials that's going to get Paul from Jerusalem to Rome. So 21, he is almost killed in the riot. Chapter 22, he gives a defense before the Jewish crowd. When he says that God told him that the Jews were not going to listen and that he needed to go preach to the Gentiles, they are infuriated by that. And so the commander of the Romans has to come down and rescue him again. So that takes us to the end of 22. He wants to scourge Paul, beat Paul, to find out what's going on here. Then he finds out Paul's a Roman citizen. And so he says, okay, well, let's let you talk to the Sanhedrin. That's at the beginning of 23. And in chapter 23, he sees that the Sanhedrin, I take it to be, is going to be hypocritical and is not going to give him a fair case. And so basically what he does is he goes right to the core of the issue and says, I'm on trial because of the resurrection. That divides the court that he's being tried before. The Sadducees, which were a religious, we would almost think of them almost as like a denomination within Judaism, a sect, if you want to call them that. They believed that there was no resurrection. The Pharisees, the more conservative, stricter sect, said that there was a resurrection. This leads them to an argument. They about kill Paul in the middle of that argument, so the commander comes down to get him again. Then the Sanhedrin council plots with some of these wicked men. The wicked men say that they're going to kill Paul. They make a vow that they're going to kill Paul. And the strategy is that they were going to ask the Sanhedrin to have him come back, and then they were just going to ambush Paul and kill him. But Paul's nephew hears about that, and so he passes that word along, and that's about where we're picking up tonight, as what are they going to do in response to the fact that Paul was going to be ambushed. They're going to send him to Caesarea, and Claudius Lysias, the commander, is going to help make that happen. Anything else? Anything else that we didn't mention last time all the way? I think it's 23 verse 23. Anything we didn't mention up to then that you would like to note now, or a question you had? Okay, great. So let's look at chapter 23 and pick up there. And let's see. I think I'll just read. I'm going to read all the way to the end, and then if you have any comments about that, we'll take it. And when he called to him two of the centurions, he said, make ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to proceed to Caesarea by the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter having this form: Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their Sanhedrin. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to speak against him before you. So the soldiers, according to their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when he had read it, he asked from what province he was. And when he learned he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Okay, go ahead.
So this is going to be kind of trying to be done in secret to avoid the ambush. So they're going to do this seemingly through the night. And it's interesting because there's almost a small little army that's set to help protect Paul on his way. How many people total do they assign? 400, 470 people. So this is, to steal a phrase from Larson, it's becoming no small potatoes. It's getting pretty serious. So there's some serious protection going on here. And so they're going to send him to Felix, and they're going to send him with a letter. And just kind of to summarize the letter, you get a few main ideas here. It mentions that Paul's a citizen, which is very important for Felix to recognize. And you get the idea that Claudius Lysias doesn't fully understand what's going on, but from what he can articulate, he seems to believe that Paul is innocent. But he does recognize that Jews want to kill him, and that's a serious problem because of his innocence and because of his lack of understanding. So he's going to send this on to a higher official to kind of take care of this. And that's kind of the idea of what the letter explains in summary. Now, is the letter 100% honest? I don't think it is. I think there's a kind of an exaggeration here. And so maybe in verse 27, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. That's true. That happened originally. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but it seems to be the idea that he's kind of covering his own tracks and saying, oh, I knew he was a Roman, and I jumped in and saved the day. That's not necessarily true. You know, he was trying to figure out what the problem was, because you don't need an uprising. But he kind of found out he was a Roman citizen later, and that was after the fact that he was going to scourge him. He was going to beat the truth out of him. He didn't mention all that. He just mentioned, oh, I was the hero. I came in and saved the citizen for you. So there was a little inaccuracy there, but it seems that the rest of the information is accurate. And so they're going to bring him on to Felix. And when they get there, Felix has a question for Paul. In verse 34, what's the question he asks? He asks of Paul. What province he's from. So he's concerned about these kind of things, maybe in light of the fact that he's a citizen, picking up on that. Maybe Larson has more to say about that. But in verse 35, I will hear you when your accusers also have come, and he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So this seems to be maybe an opportunity where Paul is going to be able to have a fair trial, maybe for the first time going on here. It is also important, the little detail there, the accusers are going to come as well. So the Jews are going to make their way to Felix as well. Larson, do you have anything to say through?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I'll put up some charts here. So first of all, Caesarea is here. This would be we've talked about this before. This was the Roman headquarters in Palestine, right? So when we think of the capital of Israel, I think we would think of Jerusalem. But for Rome's purposes, Jerusalem was not a very efficient place to have a capital. It made a lot more sense for them to have it on the coast, to have easy access to it. That is why it's called Caesarea, right? It's named after Caesar, so Caesarea. This is Antipatris right here. This is where the foot soldiers go with them, and then they will go back to Jerusalem. It looks about halfway, right? And so the horsemen will continue on with him all the way to Caesarea. But it seems to be that once they make it to Antipatris, they are well out of danger zone as far as an ambush. And so they just allow the horsemen. But 200 horsemen would be no small potatoes against. I think I say that a lot now that he mentions that. But all right. Well, okay. And then so about halfway, and they go the rest of the way the next day. I'm going to go ahead and put this up there. So we know he's going before Felix. And this is what chapter 24 is going to look like. We'll work through that in just a moment. But this is an aerial view of Caesarea. Brother Farrell Jenkins took this picture here. This is Caesarea, the complex. So right here was a theater. You can see the stadium style seating here. This was called the Hippodrome. This is where they would do horse races, kind of like NASCAR. And then this was the palace of the procurator. This seems to be the place where the praetorium would have been. So Brother Leon Malden went on a trip, and this is a sign. So you see how this juts out into the sea right there? You see this right here, how that juts out? You can see kind of the foundation there that's still left. They think this is more or less maybe what it would look like. This is a sign there in Caesarea now. And so you would have Herod's palace and the Roman praetorium. Collier was asking me about this earlier. It seems to be that the praetorium was kind of like a maybe a courthouse, maybe like if you think about Russellville's downtown, all of the buildings there kind of all combined into one. It seems to be that it was kind of used as a jail, at least for some period of time, because that seems to be where Paul is being held, but it's also where his case is being heard. So maybe it's a courthouse, jury room, jail. I don't guess they had trial by jury, but you know what I mean. All of that kind of combined into one. All right, so let me also make mention of this. So there were some things, I thought that I knew this, and I did not. I was surprised by a couple of things as I was looking to see who Felix was in the connection. So we've all heard of Herod the Great, right? This time of year, you're going to hear a lot about Herod, right? So Herod the Great was labeled as king of the Jews. He was actually an Edomite or an Idumean, but he was able to ally with the right sides within the Roman Empire to connect himself to the Roman authorities, and he was installed basically to be the Roman official over the Jewish people. So he is the one who is the Herod that we read about at the birth of Jesus, who is killing all the little ones, right? He has four. There's a lot more to this family tree than what we see right here. This is just kind of a narrowed version. He has 4 sons, 3 of whom are mentioned in the New Testament, but for the most part, Herod Antipas is the one that the rest of the Gospels will reference. So this is the one that puts John the Baptist to death. This is the one who was in the illicit marriage that we could talk about. This is the one who Jesus stood trial before. So that's every reference in the Gospels. Now, what happens is Herod's grandsons are going to be the one, grandson is going to be the one we read about. He's actually the son of Aristobulus, all right? So it's not just a direct line, but Herod Agrippa the First, he's not referred to as Agrippa the First in chapter 4, but in chapter 4 and in chapter 12, where James is killed, Peter's in prison, but then he's released, and then Herod dies because he has the issue of worms there. That's this Herod, all right? So he is Herod Agrippa the First. His son, Herod Agrippa the Second, we're going to read about in chapter 25 and chapter 26. You say, okay, that was a long way to go. One of Herod Agrippa the First, this is Herod Agrippa that killed James, was going to kill Peter. His daughter was named Drusilla. She married Felix. All right, so we're going to talk about Felix here in chapter 24. I guess I did not know that. Maybe somebody had told me that at some point along the way, but I wasn't aware of that. So in chapter 25, when Agrippa and Bernice come to visit Felix, that's his brother-in-law and sister-in-law coming to visit. When Herod Agrippa II, he will be referred to as Agrippa in 25 and 26. When he comes, that's a family meeting, but they are all within that Herod line. Now, Felix was appointed by the Romans, and he just marries into that line. Actually, Drusilla left her husband, who was another Roman government official, left him to marry Felix. And let me just say this now. Bernice was the wife of Agrippa II, which is a challenge because you'll see that the family tree doesn't branch out far enough for her to be his wife. But that does indeed seem to have been the case. I would say I don't judge, but this is Bible class, and we're judging people all the time about it. So it seems to be kind of a mess there. But anyway, so this is where Felix ties in to all of that. Okay, so now we come to chapter 24. I don't think I had anything else on chapter 23. Anybody else have questions or comments before we jump in?
I do want to say one last thing. I should have said it as part of the introduction, but recall Acts 23, verse 11, too, thinking about that promise as we conclude this chapter and going into the next chapter. The Lord speaking to Paul, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." Larson talked a lot about the providence of the things going on around Paul. Chapter 23, we see that, the perseverance, having the 470 and the 200 go on, things like that. But also think about Paul's faithfulness to keep that promise in mind as he goes through the things we're going to look at across the next couple of chapters.
Very good. Anything else? 23 before we jump into 24. Any questions about the kind of the setting here? All right, so Felix is the governor, seems to be the overseer of most of the region. And so we're going to come to that now. You want to read 1 through 9? I think that'd be good.
That'd be perfect. Now, after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus, a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul, and when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, "Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity, is being brought to this nation by your foresight. We accept it always, and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by, and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him." And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so.
Very good. Okay, so it takes 5 days for the Jewish opponents to come to Caesarea. I don't know that that's an extremely long time. We would imagine a couple of days travel anyway and making arrangement for that. So it doesn't seem to me, I know 5 days would be a long time to wait nowadays because it's not that far of a distance. But I think figuring out Paul's not there, making arrangements to go, the travel time to get there, I don't think 5 days is that much of a delay in making this happen. And they come, and it looks to me like with Tertullus, they have a hired attorney. They have a hired hand to bring these charges. They are doing this not just because they have, and I don't know that we would necessarily condemn them for hiring someone to make the case, but this is not a simple cut and dry case in that they are having to hire someone to bring these charges before the Roman government on their behalf. Now, how does Tertullus approach Felix as he introduces these charges? Compliments him. What else? What would you say? Buttering him up is exactly the way I have it phrased in my notes. I guess that goes with the potatoes. He is buttering him up. And here's the thing. If you read contemporary sources, the New Testament doesn't give us a lot of information about the character of the man Felix. I think we can learn some things. I think we could pull some things out. But it doesn't tell us a lot about the character of Felix here. Evidently, Felix was a horrible person, right? Like you read Josephus, who's probably our best Jewish historian of the time. He says that he would address things with cruelty. I think it was one that said he was somebody that had the power of a king, but with the mind of a slave. That is, he just did not have the capacity to have the power that he had, and that he used that to dominate and because of greed and all sorts of other things. I think we can see some of that here, but the New Testament really doesn't address that. So then to imagine Tertullus coming to Felix and saying, "We have, because of your provisions and your reforms that have been carried out for this nation, you are welcome to us everywhere, in every place." That's like completely amiss from what the real Jewish attitude would have been to Felix. Now, I don't know that we would read too much into that, except to say that this indicates that their pursuit here is not particularly about truth, but about getting to Paul. And I think we see that. And the fact that Paul is having to confront these underhanded challenges is interesting, because what he does is he does not resort to the same thing. Rather, he tells what we understand to be the truth and kind of says, let the chips fall where they may. Right? He doesn't resort to methods like the Jewish opposition does, while I think he's trying to defend himself. I think he's trying to make a case that he doesn't deserve to be in these situations, but he doesn't do so in some way to undermine a real, genuine search for the truth. And I think that's what we see already. And Tertullus says, we don't want to weary you. We don't want to tire you. We don't want to inconvenience you. It's like, well, we got a really easy way for you not to inconvenience Felix. Like dropping the charges would be great. That would not inconvenience anyone. But anyway, that's not really their pursuit. Anything? I think that's through verse 4. Anything?
No, not through verse 4.
Anything else? So here's the accusations that they have. First of all, they say, my text says he's a real pest. What did yours say there in verse 5 instead of being a real pest?
A plague.
A plague, yeah. So they view him, cancerous, that he stirs up dissension, that he is the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and that he tried to desecrate the temple. I think those are the three key things. Stirs up dissension or riots, ringleader of this sect of the Nazarenes, and he tried to desecrate the temple. They were going to judge him for that. Lysias, they say, gets in the way of us carrying out our own law, and so we want you to see that we are accusing him of these things, and that he was, and in fact, that he was guilty of those things, so that this can be carried out. Now, here's the thing: when they accuse him of these three things, trying him according to their own law, it seems to me that Tertullus still does not accept the fact that Paul did not actually take a Gentile into the temple, and trying him according to their own law meant the death penalty for them, right? So these are not light charges. And so to say this to Felix, to say, we were going to try him according to our own law, seems to be suggesting that we already had a fair and just trial process in place. Whereas if we read 21, 22, and 23, we know that it was anything but a fair and just trial process. And even if we were just talking about the trials, he does not even mention the ambush situation, which of course you wouldn't, since it would have been the people on your side that would have been guilty of that. Now, Claudius Lysias does mention the ambush in the letter that he wrote to Felix, so perhaps Felix has some awareness of that, but Tertullus, of course, doesn't mention it here. All right, anything else? I don't know about that. I would say, I don't know. I think it probably is an effort simply to appeal to Felix as the higher authority in this. I think it's probably like a governmental system where you're just trying to go to the person of the higher rank, and basically, I think you're right there. I don't know that there's contention between Lysias and Felix, but they are trying to say that the Romans interfered in a place where they shouldn't have. Because I don't think that the Jews really want Felix to try him. I think he wants them to say, no, this is a case that needs to be tried back in Jerusalem so they can handle things as they want to back there.
I do think it was well said, the idea, so they're not really after the truth. They're after Paul. You get some of that. I mean, you can tell they're just kind of shifting things, changing things to fit their narrative. They mentioned Paul as a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. And so they kind of get the idea that he's stirring people up. In Acts 21, verse 7, it says, then all the city was stirred up. That's after they reacted. The Jews themselves, the Jews from Asia, reacted to Paul strongly. So really, they're here saying, Paul came in and stirred everybody up. And then you go look at 21. No, they were the ones that did exactly what they're accusing Paul of doing. So they're just kind of creating their own narrative. I think it's interesting the way he refers to Paul as a ringleader. At least in the New King James Version, it says a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So what does it mean to be a Nazarene? Right, yeah. Well, I think maybe a Nazarene would be, maybe you could say it's somebody from Nazareth. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But would they be following somebody from Nazareth? Yes, they would be following Jesus. So I don't think it's an inaccurate statement, but I think maybe there's a derogatory motive behind it, and maybe that's just speculation here. But Nazareth wouldn't have been a super important city to Rome. You get the idea maybe Nazareth was looked down upon in certain ways, like in John 1, can anything good come out of Nazareth? So I think maybe this is said purposefully as in a kind of a derogatory sense to kind of just to further this pushing against Paul here. This idea.
Yeah, I think it may be like if he is causing riots, not only is it him individually, but he also has an organization behind him as well, and they've come to know it as the sect of the Nazarenes. So.
That's right. Yeah, and you mentioned too, but they frame Lysias in a very bad bad side. They almost say, like, we had this peaceful process according to our law that was well ordered and stuff, and he came in and disrupted it. And that's not at all what happened.
That's right. Yeah, I think those three charges, I think if we look at Paul's response, I think that's what we will see him respond to. Riots, ringleader of the sect, and desecrating the temple. I think when we look at the response, I think it's helpful to know what he's being charged with, because then we can kind of interpret Paul's understandings here. Do you have anything else through?
Not through now.
Anybody else? Any questions? Yes, sir.
This is 5 days or so. We got those 40 guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. They either were exaggerating their commitment or they're very hungry. I guess they died hungry because they never got him. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Anybody else? All right. Let's go to verse 10 then. So I'm going to read 10 to 21, if that's okay, and then we'll have some comments there. And when the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul answered, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge of this to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Since you are able to ascertain the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship, and neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor across the city did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot, nor are they able to prove to you of what they are now accusing me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call the sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, for which these men are waiting, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. In view of this, I always do my best to maintain always a conscience without fault before God and before men. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, in which they found me, having been purified in the temple, but without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia, who ought to have been present before you and make the accusation, if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the Sanhedrin, other than for this one statement which I shouted while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today."
So you have the Jews, and they come before Felix. They have this very eloquent, well-spoken orator named Tertullus, who's defending Paul in this situation. Paul, yeah, himself. And I think in some sense, maybe you could say the Spirit. I hope that's not a stretch to say. So going back to what Larson they mentioned of either last class or the class before, Acts 9, verse 15, kind of during Paul's conversion process. But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." And then we may mention of Acts 10 that when they stand in front of kings and councils, that the Spirit will give them wisdom of what to say. So maybe in a sense, hope it's not a stretch to say maybe the Spirit, Paul's filled the Spirit this moment too. But so far you've seen Lysias has provided a few small lies, but he's been pretty truthful overall. The Jews have provided major lies. And like Larson mentioned, alluded to earlier, what's Paul going to say? He's just going to say the truth. That's what Paul wants to communicate. And Paul mentions he was only there for 12 days. And Larson, you can answer this too. Why do you think Paul mentions that? I think that's right too. That's kind of what I understood too. Is I think he's saying, look, I was only there for 12 days. And part of that, I was, bound up. I didn't have time to create this widespread uprising that's going on. So I think that might be the importance of mentioning that.
Can I say just a word about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So he says 12 days. How long has he been in Caesarea? 5, right? So you go back 5 days. Look at chapter 21 and verse 27. Now, when the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon noticing him in the temple, began to throw all the crowd in confusion and laid hands on him. So Paul went and offered these sacrifices, and it seems to be went through a 7-day of purification. That's verse 26. He went through the days of purification. And when the 7 days were over is when, so Paul was able to say, I have a complete timeline of events. I went in and offered a sacrifice, went through 7 days of purification, which I take to be would have kept him pretty restricted from engaging with crowds very much. And then on the 7th day, they see Paul, So Paul literally would have had like 20 minutes to be causing a riot. It's when the seventh day was over. And so they see him, and that's what caused the riot. So, and in addition to that, you put all these days together, he has spent the night in prison and things like that. Paul's saying, it has not been that long. I have not had opportunities in order to be there in order for this to have happened. As they are accusing me. It would require a little more time, you think, than to just show up in a city and automatically cause a riot like this. He's saying, I didn't even have time to stir anybody up.
And that's great, because with that in mind, it makes a lot of sense out of 12 and 13, where he says, here's the accusations, but verse 13, nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. So, it goes right along with that idea of he can lay out the timeline and recognize that he didn't have time for those things. Verse 14, I think Paul's giving the idea, and Larson, jump in too if you need to clean up my mess, but this is not just some sect. This is kind of the proper mode of faithfulness to Yahweh. And Paul's saying, I worship Yahweh, and I believe and accept the law and prophets the same way they do. Maybe not the same way they do, but like they do. And what's in the law and the prophets that maybe Paul would be trying to point at here in a minute? Kind of have to read my mind, but what'd you say, Amanda? The resurrection. I think within the law and prophets, it points to Jesus. All along the way, you see Jesus sprinkled in the law and the prophets. And so I think Paul is absolutely going to say in verse 14, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. He's again saying, I'm not against that. I'm not, the accusations they're making may not necessarily be true. And in verse 15, Paul is going to mention a few other things he has in common. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept. They have this same hope and same faithfulness, but hope of what? And he goes back to that idea of the resurrection, just like Amanda made mention of. And so Larson talked about when he's in front of the Sanhedrin, maybe he kind of uses that as a strategy. But Larson said, no, he does it all along the way. And here's one of those times he's standing in front of a completely different person, and he's still making mention of the resurrection. All along the way, that's what Paul wants to focus on. And he's going to try to bring everything back to that. And here he is, he's on trial, but he's looking for opportunities to make mention of the resurrection and help people maybe understand the gospel. And do you have anything to say about that too, Larson?
Just something really quick. So it's interesting to me that before Felix, he would make a big deal about the unity that he has with his accusers. I'm serving according to the law and the prophets. I have the same hope they do. Verse 15, these men are also waiting for this. I do serve the God of our fathers. I think what's happening here is I think Paul is saying they're going to make a big deal out of the distinctions that are here. And he's saying, I am not doing anything that departs from what they believe. Obviously, fundamentally what they believe as far as a commitment to the law. Because what I'm thinking is that maybe they would be able to stoke the distinction enough to say that the Romans might say, well, this is dangerous, right? We got to get rid of this guy. We got to get rid of this movement, because if they're going to drive a wedge between the Jewish people and cause this kind of... And Paul is trying to say, listen, the wedge that's being drawn here is not something that they don't believe already. They're already committed to things like the scriptures, the God of our fathers, the hope of the resurrection. Any wedge that was there had already been driven between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. This was not something that was new. And so I think he's emphasized. We'll see that as he goes through, emphasizing. I say this because all through my raising, especially studying the book of Acts, I almost always had like a very definitive period about the old law, right? And Paul doesn't view it as a period. Right? He views it as, I am following the law and the prophets by doing what it was always pointing to. And I think as a Jew, he could say that in a special way that I can't as a Gentile who's not obligated all those things. But it seems to me that Paul is saying, I haven't let go of those Jewish things. I am following the God of our fathers. I'm in accordance with the law and the prophets, but I'm doing so in hope of the resurrection, just like them. But then, of course, he says, but I am following the way. And that's how Paul refers to describe it. He doesn't want to be called the sect of the Nazarenes. He wants to be called the way. And in your text, like it is in mine, it's probably capitalized because I think he's talking about the way being Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so, anyway, so that takes us through verse 15.
Yeah, very good. Verse 16, he's going to mention, he's used similar phrases before, but I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense towards God and men. So I think the idea, I always live faithfully. I'm not trying to stir up anything. I'm just trying to be genuine, faithfulness towards God, peaceable towards men. And again, we may mention Paul's just communicating the truth here. 17 through 19, he's going to talk about the true happenings of some of these surroundings about the false accusations that are made. He tells them why he went to Jerusalem in the first place. In verse 17, to bring alms and offerings to the nation. It may be important later on that he does say this directly to Felix. Maybe there's a connection we can make down the road. 18, in verse 18, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with the mob nor with tumult. What he was doing was appropriate. Paul wasn't doing anything out of pocket. The accusations, again, aren't true. It's just things they synthesize about Paul based on their preconceived prejudice they had towards him. In verse 19, he's going to back this up, saying that he's innocent. He's going to say the people who made these things up, who synthesized these accusations in the first place, they're not even here today. They're not witnessing against me. The people who, quote unquote, saw this thing happen. And then in verse 20, he says the people who are here today seems to be at least the people who were involved in the Sanhedrin Council. He says, what happened when I stood before the council? What did they say? And if you recall back to that, half the council said, we find no fault in this man. Half the people said this, and they weren't able to come to their own conclusion according to their law. Remember, the Jews made the defense and said, well, we tried to give him a trial according to our law. Well, here Paul's saying, whenever you did that, you found no cause against me. You couldn't even agree on anything, and half of you sided with me. And so I think Paul is using truthful evidence of what really happened here to make his defense. But he does confirm one accusation, though. In verse 21, he does confess to speaking about the resurrection in front of the Sanhedrin. So again, he's giving a defense for himself, but he circles back to that idea of what he truly wants to communicate, the resurrection. Now, is there any kind of lawful offense about speaking about a resurrection in the Roman law? Not that I know of. I could be wrong. I don't know ancient Roman law, but I could be wrong. But I think Paul is, again, he's just trying to bring that up and to witness in that way. So not only, and maybe there's two ideas here, he cleverly does this, not only will the Jews not deny it because they have the same hope of a resurrection too, maybe a little different than the way Paul mentions, but by bringing this up, he gets the point. He gets to point people towards the gospel and have them think about the resurrection of Jesus, which is his ultimate goal all along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in verses 16 and 17, I think he's responding to the riot accusation by saying, consider why I came here. It was to bring a monetary gift to the nation and my people. So that's kind of in contrast with somebody who's coming to raise riots, right? Here's somebody who's bringing a monetary contribution. And then with regards to the temple, he's like, I was purified there and didn't have anybody I wasn't supposed to with me. And I think that we understand this. I think a lot of our law system is inherited from the Roman law system, where we would say that without evidence, you can't convict someone, right? And I don't know that Paul is being considered innocent until proven guilty, because he's going to stay in jail for a long time without any real accusations. But I think he's right here. Of course he's right. He's speaking inspiredly. But it's helpful for us to see here. He's saying if you don't have evidence to bring to the table, it's almost impossible to verify and justify an accusation against people. You can accuse people of whatever you want, but I think he's saying without eyewitness testimony that I was there in the temple, that they saw me, because remember, even back in chapter 21, they assumed that he had been in the temple with Trophimus, the Gentile. Nobody even saw that, mostly because it didn't happen, but even if it did, the lack of eyewitness evidence would put Paul in a good standing here. You would think that would be the basis upon which, he could be vindicating this. The other thing is this: he wants Felix to know what the actual charge they're bringing is. They don't mention the actual charge. The actual charge is his declaration of the resurrection, as Collier mentioned. He's not trying to say, I have no idea why they're charging me with something. He knows why they're after him. But it's because of the way, and it's because of the resurrection. And he wants Felix and he wants them to understand that he knows why they're coming after him.
Any thoughts, comments before we move on? You want to read to the end of the chapter?
That'd be great.
Okay. All right, picking up in verse 22. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound.
Okay, so in 22 and 23, so at first it mentions that Felix has a more accurate knowledge of the way. I don't know that that means that he knows a lot about following Jesus. I think it probably means that he is aware of the division that is existing between people who are following Jesus and Judaism. Like when Paul brings up the way, I think he's probably saying, oh, it's one of those kinds of cases, right? It's one of those issues. I don't take it to be here that what we have here is Felix being an expert knowing on the way, because Paul has to clarify some of that for him. But he does say this. He says, when Lysias comes, I'll get more information about the case. Now, that seems to be a little bit underhanded too, because hasn't Claudius Lysias already given his testimony about the case? If you were reading the letter, what was Claudius Lysias's conclusion about Paul? He says he hasn't done anything worthy. He's like, he said, he's accused by questions of the law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. And so if that's the case, then Claudius Lysias has already given his testimony, but this provides an opportunity for Felix to have a justification as to why he can keep Paul in prison there. Now, it does seem to be that Felix is making it a rather accommodative for Paul, that he is able to have rest and not prevent his friends from ministering to him. I think in many cases, prior to the modern prison era, if you were in prison, it would be basically your friends and family that would take care of you in prison. If not, you would be basically just on a bare minimum diet and pretty suffering. So basically, I think Felix is saying, make sure you allow people who will care for him easy access to him. Now, after some days, Felix and Drusilla, they come and they keep listening to Paul. And I love this in verse 25. What Paul could do over this period of time would say something that would appeal to Felix and even Drusilla. What he does is he preaches to two people who the record seems to indicate lacked self-control, lacked righteousness, were living as if there was no judgment coming. He addresses them and talks about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Now, that is not a message that would have been very nice. It was kind in that it's what they needed, but it would not have been very nice to people like Felix and Drusilla. But I love this because whereas the Jews praise Felix for all of the provisions and reforms that he had brought, Paul says what you need to know is about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. And I've thought about this. So, like, I'm interested in politics, and I like studying history. And I just wonder if I could have sat down across the table with some of the greats, whether in American or world history, or if I could sit down with the political officials today, if I was able to sit down and have a conversation with them, what would that conversation be, right? And immediately comes to my mind, well, I'd really like to talk about the benefits of free markets and low government spending and tax cuts. And, I have my own ideas about foreign intervention. I hope that I would have the courage that Paul had to talk to the people who are in office about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Whoever's in office, right? And if that's not my primary concern with regards to the political leaders, I probably have my priorities misarranged. Maybe Paul had an idea about tax cuts, right? Maybe he had an idea about what Rome's foreign policy should be. But he goes to a more striking core fundamental premise here, which is to talk about this. So, could Paul use his Roman citizenship? Absolutely. Could he take advantage of the blessings of being a Roman? For sure. And I don't think it would be wrong for us to take advantage of blessings and to participate in citizenship as Americans. But I think Paul shows here that his Roman connections were not the most fundamental thing. His connections to the one who was coming to judge the world were the fundamental things. Felix pushes him off and says, go away, and when I have a more convenient season, I'll call you. Now, I don't know about this, but I know in the New Testament we don't ever have a record of that more convenient season arriving. Because Paul is going to be under Felix's imprisonment for 2 years. And you would think, well, within those 2 years, surely a more convenient season arose. It doesn't. I think we always have this idea that when I get around this next corner, right, when I do this, when I get this accomplished, when I do that, then it'll be a more convenient season. And it's amazing how things mound up around the next corner. Right? It never is a more convenient season. And so what's going to happen is Felix had hoped to get money from Paul. You see that? I think that's connected to what Collier mentioned earlier. He came to bring his nation alms, came to bring them a gift. Felix is thinking, if this guy's bringing his nation a gift, he must have money. Maybe I can get some of that. And then wanting to do the Jews a favor, he leaves Paul in prison, and that's when Festus is going to take over. All right. Any thoughts or comments?
I think he had some knowledge of the way beforehand, because earlier it says, Paul says you could ascertain that 12 days, and so he could either check that out. Paul had been there,
Yeah.
lived there, others were there with daughters. So had he heard? Did he have a little bit of knowledge of what was going on, and this clears it up? Or because how could he ascertain that he had been there?
Yeah.
The days before? He could call people.
Yeah, I think because of his position, he could have accessed more witnesses. Like he could have pressed the Jews to make sure they brought more witnesses to Caesarea. If they really want to push this case, they could have. I don't know about the more excellent knowledge of the way going back to just the 12 days before. I'm wondering if that didn't have to do with like more long-term knowledge. But you may be right. It may have to do with what was happening.
You call it witness from the ones in Caesarea who can tell you I was here for those days.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I don't know about that. All right. We'll pick up right there and start in chapter 25, Lord willing, on Wednesday night. Thank y'all very much.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.